The telegram arrived at 8:10 on the morning of November 14, 1896, and no one who read it felt alarmed. It was addressed to the superintendent of the Donner Summit Weather Station, a small outpost perched at 7,000 feet in the Sierra Nevada, and it reported that a low-pressure system was moving inland from the Pacific. The language was technical, measured, the sort of bulletin that arrived twice weekly during winter months. The superintendent, a man named Morris Calloway, read it twice, folded it into his logbook, and returned to his breakfast. Outside, the sky was clear. The temperature hovered just above freezing. There was no wind. Calloway's station was not a destination. It was a relay point, manned by 3 men whose job was to record atmospheric conditions and telegraph them downslope to Sacramento. They lived in a stone building with a wood stove, a desk, and a narrow sleeping loft. They saw almost no visitors after October. The nearest settlement, a logging camp called Cisco Grove, lay 8 miles west along a maintenance trail that followed the old emigrant road. In winter, that trail became impassable for weeks at a time, but in November, it was still open, still navigable, still considered safe by anyone who had spent time in the mountains. On the morning of the 14th, Calloway was not alone. 2 men had arrived the previous afternoon, a surveyor named Paul Drexel and a photographer named Samuel Knecht, both employed by the Southern Pacific Railroad. They had been documenting the proposed route for a second rail line through the pass, a project that would eventually be abandoned for lack of funding, and they had stopped at the station to warm themselves and take a hot meal before continuing west. Calloway had offered them the loft. They accepted. There was no sense of imposition. Men traveling through high country understood that hospitality was practical, not sentimental. Drexel and Knecht had planned to leave at first light, but they lingered. Knecht had strained his ankle 2 days earlier and was reluctant to test it on uneven ground. Drexel, who had hiked the trail before, suggested they wait until midday, when the sun would soften the frost and make walking easier. Calloway, who had no reason to disagree, offered more coffee. The 3 men sat near the stove and spoke about inconsequential things: the price of timber, the likelihood of statehood for Arizona, whether the new century would bring dirigibles or something else entirely. Outside, the air remained still. At 11:30, Calloway's assistant, a young man named Thomas Beale, returned from checking the anemometer. He reported that the wind had shifted slightly to the southwest and that the barometric pressure had dropped by 1/10 of an inch. Calloway noted this in the logbook but did not comment. 1/10 of an inch was not unusual. It was not cause for concern. By noon, Drexel and Knecht had packed their gear and stood ready to depart. Calloway walked them to the door and shook their hands. He told them the trail was clear as far as Cisco Grove and that they should reach it before dark. He did not tell them to hurry. He did not suggest they reconsider. The sky, though now faintly overcast, still held no visible threat. Drexel thanked him. Knecht adjusted his pack. They walked west along the trail, their boots crunching softly on frozen ground. Calloway returned to the station and resumed his work. At 1 o'clock, he took another reading. The pressure had dropped again. He made a note of it. At 2, he noticed that the western horizon had darkened, though not dramatically. At 3, the first snowflakes began to fall. By 4 o'clock, the snow was steady but light, and Calloway still did not feel worried. He knew that Drexel and Knecht were 3 hours ahead of him, well on their way to lower elevation. He knew that Cisco Grove had a telegraph line, and that if the weather worsened, someone there would send word. He also knew that the trail, though narrow, was well marked and that men with experience did not lose their way in daylight. He did not know that Drexel and Knecht had stopped to photograph a rock formation 2 miles from the station, or that Knecht's ankle had worsened, or that they had agreed to rest for 20 minutes in a sheltered hollow just off the trail. He did not know that they had misjudged the time, or that the snow had thickened rapidly after 4:30, or that by 5 o'clock visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet. He did not know, because there was no way to know, that they were still only 5 miles from the station when the storm overtook them completely. At 6 o'clock, Calloway lit the station's oil lamp and closed the shutters. At 7, he prepared dinner. At 8, he sat down to write his evening report. The snow was now falling heavily and the wind had risen, but he attributed this to the system mentioned in the morning telegram. He expected it to pass by morning. He went to bed at 9. The following day, the storm continued. The day after that, it intensified. By the 17th, more than 6 feet of snow had fallen, and the trail to Cisco Grove was buried under drifts that reached the height of a man's chest. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Communication with the valley was cut off. Calloway and his assistant remained at the station, unable to leave, unable to send word, unaware that anyone was missing. It was not until November 23rd, 9 days after Drexel and Connect had left the station, that a search party from Cisco Grove reached the summit. They found Calloway and Beale alive and well. They asked if anyone had passed through recently. Calloway said yes, 2 men, on the 14th. The leader of the search party, a foreman named Hollis Grant, asked what time they had left. Calloway consulted his logbook. He said noon. Grant closed his eyes. He said they should have left at dawn. He said they should never have been allowed to start. Calloway, in his later deposition, stated that he had not believed the weather posed an immediate danger. He stated that the men had appeared capable and well-equipped. He stated that the trail had been clear when they departed, and that nothing in the morning telegram had suggested an urgent threat. He stated that he had acted in accordance with standard practice. The deposition is preserved in the archives of the California State Library. In the margin, beside Calloway's description of the morning, someone has written in pencil, "They had 4 hours. They could have turned back." The Sierra Nevada in November occupies a peculiar place in the calendar of mountain weather. It is not yet deep winter, when travel is understood to be impossible, nor is it still autumn, when the passes remain reliably open. It is a season of transition, and transitions, by their nature, resist definition. Men who worked in the mountains during this period understood that snow could come early or late, that storms could arrive without warning or pass through without consequence, and that predicting which would occur was a matter of experience, instinct, and luck. Morris Calloway had been stationed at Donner Summit for 3 years. Before that, he had worked as a telegraph operator in Virginia City and as a freight clerk in Reno. He was not a mountaineer. He was a bureaucrat, competent and methodical, who had taken the position because it paid $60 a month and required no supervision. His job was to record data, not to interpret it, and he did so with diligence. The logbooks he maintained are models of precision, neat columns, consistent notation, no corrections. He was the kind of man who followed procedures because procedures existed for a reason. Thomas Beale, his assistant, was younger and less experienced, but he had grown up in the foothills and had spent summers working for the Forestry Service. He knew how to read clouds and wind direction. He knew the difference between snow that would melt by afternoon and snow that would accumulate. On the morning of November 14th, when Calloway asked him whether the weather looked threatening, Beale said it did not. Later, during his own deposition, he was asked to explain what he meant. He said the air had felt stable. He said there was no smell of moisture, no unusual movement in the trees. He said he had been wrong, but that he had not been careless. The question of carelessness or negligence or culpability dominated much of the inquiry that followed. It is a question that appears frequently in the margins of disaster, particularly when the disaster might have been avoided through different decisions. But the inquiry into what happened at Donner Summit in November of 1896 was not interested in assigning blame so much as understanding why reasonable men, acting reasonably, had allowed 2 other men to walk into conditions that would kill them. The answer, insofar as there was one, lay not in what Calloway and Beale knew, but in what they believed they knew. Weather prediction in 1896 was not an exact science. The United States Weather Bureau, established only 6 years earlier, relied on telegraph reports from scattered stations to construct regional forecasts, but those forecasts were often vague, sometimes contradictory, and rarely accurate beyond 24 hours. The telegram that arrived at Calloway's station on the morning of the 14th had mentioned a low-pressure system, but it had not specified the system's intensity, its speed, or its likely path. It had not used the word storm. It had not suggested that travel should be suspended. Calloway, reading it, had no reason to believe that the situation was anything other than routine. Paul Drexel and Samuel Knecht were not inexperienced travelers. Drexel, 34 years old, had worked for the Southern Pacific for 6 years and had surveyed routes through the Cascades, the Rockies, and the Sierra. He carried a compass, a topographic map, and a pocket barometer. He knew how to navigate by terrain features when visibility was poor. Knecht, 29, was less familiar with mountains, but he was fit, cautious, and accustomed to working outdoors in difficult conditions. Both men wore wool clothing, heavy boots, and oilskin coats. They carried enough food for 3 days. By the standards of the time, they were adequately prepared. The decision to delay their departure until noon was not irrational. Knecht's ankle, though not severely injured, was painful enough that he walked with a limp. Drexel, evaluating the situation, concluded that it was safer to rest the injury for a few hours than to risk aggravating it on frozen ground. Calloway, when consulted, agreed. Later, Drexel's widow would testify that her husband had always been cautious, perhaps excessively so, and that he would not have left the station if he believed the weather posed a serious risk. She said he had written her a letter the night before, which she received 2 weeks after his death, in which he described the summit as cold but clear, and said he expected to be home by the 20th. The letter is part of the archived record. It is written in a steady hand. It contains no premonition. What Calloway, Beale, Drexel, and Knecht all shared on the morning of November 14th was a belief in margins. They believed that conditions could worsen, certainly, but that worsening would be gradual, predictable, something that could be responded to if necessary. They believed that the trail was familiar enough and short enough that even if snow began to fall, it would not prevent 2 competent men from reaching shelter. They believed, above all, that there was time to wait, time to decide, time to adjust. This belief was not unreasonable. It was, in fact, supported by experience. Storms in the Sierra often announced themselves with hours of warning. Lowering clouds, rising wind, a drop in temperature. The storm that arrived on the afternoon of November 14th did none of these things. It simply appeared. At 2:30, when Drexel and Knecht stopped to photograph a granite outcrop 3 miles west of the station, the snow was falling lightly. Knecht, in his journal, recovered later, described it as picturesque. He noted that the light was soft, and that the rock face dusted with white would make a compelling image. Drexel set up the camera. Knecht adjusted the tripod. They worked for 15 minutes. When they finished, the snow was still light. They continued west. At 3:15, they stopped again. Knecht's ankle was bothering him. Drexel suggested they rest in a hollow just off the trail, a natural depression sheltered by pines. They sat down. Knecht unlaced his boot and examined his foot. Drexel ate a piece of dried beef. They did not speak much. The snow continued, heavier now, but not alarmingly so. At 3:30, Drexel said they should keep moving. Knecht agreed. They stood, shouldered their packs, and returned to the trail. It was here, according to later reconstruction, that they made their first mistake. Not a dramatic error, but a small miscalculation. The hollow where they had rested was slightly south of the main trail, and when they resumed walking, they veered southwest instead of due west. The deviation was minor, perhaps 30 degrees, but over the next half-mile it carried them into rougher terrain, where the path was less distinct and the ground more uneven. By the time they realized they were off course, the snow had thickened to the point where visibility was reduced to a few dozen yards. They stopped. Drexel consulted his compass. He determined that they needed to turn north to regain the trail. They did so, but the landscape, now obscured by snow, offered few landmarks. They walked for 20 minutes. They did not find the trail. At 4 o'clock they stopped again. Knecht suggested they retrace their steps. Drexel agreed. They turned around and walked east. back toward the hollow. But the snow had covered their tracks, and without clear visibility, they could not be certain they were moving in the right direction. At 4:30 they stopped again. Drexel took another compass reading. He said they were still moving east, which meant they should eventually reach the station. Knecht asked how far. Drexel said perhaps 2 miles, perhaps 3. He said they could make it before dark, if they kept a steady pace. They did not make it before dark. The sun set at 5:20. By then, the snow was falling so heavily that Drexel could not see Knecht walking 10 feet ahead of him. The temperature had dropped. The wind, which had been calm all morning, now gusted hard enough to sting their faces. They continued east, moving slowly, feeling their way over uneven ground. At 6 o'clock, Knecht fell. He did not injure himself, but when he stood, he said his ankle was too painful to continue. Drexel helped him to a cluster of boulders. They crouched in the lee of the rocks and discussed their options. Knecht suggested they stop for the night and resume at first light. Drexel hesitated. He said they might be very close to the station. He said it would be safer to keep moving. Knecht said he could not walk any farther. Drexel, in the end, agreed. They were not equipped to spend a night in the open, but they were also not equipped to continue in darkness through a storm. They cleared a space among the boulders and spread their oilskin coats on the ground. They sat close together, their backs against the rock. They ate the last of their food. They did not light a fire. There was no dry wood, and the wind would have extinguished it immediately. At some point during the night, Drexel's journal does not specify when, they must have realized that their situation was more serious than they had allowed themselves to believe. At some point, they must have understood that the storm was not going to pass quickly, that the station was farther away than they had thought, that their decision to stop and rest, though reasonable at the time, had cost them hours they could not afford to lose. At some point, they must have looked at each other and known they had waited too long. But this realization, if it occurred, left no record. The archives contain very little testimony about what Paul Drexel and Samuel Knecht experienced between the evening of November 14th and the morning of November 16th. What exists is fragmentary. A waterlogged journal, a few personal items recovered from their bodies, and the observations of the men who found them. The journal, which belonged to Drexel, was badly damaged by snow and moisture, and many of its pages are illegible. What can be read suggests that Drexel remained composed, or at least wished to appear so. His entries are brief and factual. They do not express fear. The last legible entry is dated November 15th. It reads, "Still snowing. Wind from west. No visibility. Will attempt to reach station at daybreak if conditions improve." Conditions did not improve. The storm that struck Donner Summit on the afternoon of November 14th was not the worst storm ever recorded in the Sierra Nevada, nor was it the longest or the coldest. But it was severe, and it was sudden, and it arrived at a time when 2 men were exposed, disoriented, and already compromised by fatigue and injury. By the morning of the 15th, more than 3 feet of snow had fallen, and the wind had driven it into drifts that erased every trace of the trail. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees above zero. Visibility remained near zero. Drexel and Knecht, according to the reconstruction, left their shelter at dawn. They moved east, still believing they could reach the station. They walked for perhaps an hour. Then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, they stopped. It is possible that Knecht's ankle had worsened to the point where he could no longer walk. It is possible that they became disoriented and chose to wait for the storm to clear. It is possible that they realized at last that they were not going to make it, and decided to conserve their strength rather than exhaust themselves in a futile effort. Whatever the reason, they did not continue. They found a stand of pines and dug into the snow at the base of the largest tree, creating a shallow pit that offered some protection from the wind. They sat down. They wrapped themselves in their coats, and they waited. It is difficult to know what they thought during those hours. The journal offers no insight. Knecht left no written record. The only evidence of their state of mind comes from the position in which their bodies were later found, seated close together, arms around each other, heads bowed. The searchers who discovered them noted that they appeared to have died quietly, without struggle. There were no signs of panic, no scattered belongings, no indication that they had attempted to move at the last moment. They had simply stopped. This image, two men sitting in the snow, waiting for something that would not come, has been the subject of considerable reflection among historians who have studied the incident. It is tempting to imagine that they spoke to each other, that they offered comfort or reassurance, that they made peace with their situation. But there is no evidence to support such imaginings. The truth is that we do not know what they said, or whether they said anything at all. We know only that they were found together, and that they had been dead for at least 12 hours when the search party reached them. The search party, led by Hollis Grant, did not set out from Cisco Grove until November 22nd. By then, the storm had passed, but the trail remained impassable, and it took Grant's men more than 6 hours to reach the summit. They arrived at Calloway Station in the late afternoon and learned that Drexel and Knecht had left on the 14th. Grant, who had organized searches before, understood immediately that the men were almost certainly dead. He asked Calloway to describe their route and their condition. Calloway did so. Grant made notes. He said they would begin searching at first light. The search took 2 days. On the morning of the 23rd, Grant and 4 men retraced the trail west, probing drifts with poles and calling out periodically. They found nothing. On the 24th, they expanded their search to the south, moving through rough terrain where the trail was less distinct. At midday, one of the men saw a dark shape protruding from the snow. He called the others. They dug carefully. They uncovered a boot, then a leg, then 2 bodies. Grant's report, filed with the county coroner, describes the scene in plain language. He notes the location, approximately 4 miles west-southwest of the weather station, and the condition of the bodies, which he describes as frozen solid. He notes that both men were fully clothed and that their packs, still on their backs, contained maps, surveying instruments, and photographic equipment. He notes that Drexel's journal was found in his coat pocket, though much damaged by moisture. He does not speculate about what the men were thinking or feeling. He records only what he observed. The coroner's report, issued 3 weeks later, lists the cause of death as exposure. It notes that both men had been in good health prior to their deaths, and that neither had suffered any traumatic injury. It concludes that their deaths were accidental, and that no party could be held liable. It does not address the question of whether their deaths were preventable, but the question remained, and it was taken up by the Southern Pacific Railroad, which conducted its own inquiry. The railroad's investigator, a man named Eugene Marsh, interviewed Calloway, Beale, and several residents of Cisco Grove. He reviewed weather records, examined the trail, and attempted to reconstruct the timeline of events. His report, submitted in January of 1897, is more critical than the coroner's. Marsh concludes that Drexel and Knecht should not have been allowed to depart at noon, that the weather conditions, though not yet severe, were trending unfavorable, and that a prudent course of action would have been to delay departure until the following day, or, failing that, to insist that the men leave at dawn. He notes that Calloway, though well-intentioned, lacked the experience necessary to assess mountain weather accurately. He recommends that future station superintendents receive training in forecasting and that protocols be established for advising travelers. The report is preserved in the railroad's archives. In the margin, beside Marsh's recommendation, someone has written, "Agreed, but what protocol prevents hesitation?" The question is rhetorical, but it is also central. The tragedy at Donner Summit was not the result of a single catastrophic decision. It was the result of a series of small delays, minor misjudgments and missed opportunities, none of which seemed critical at the time. Drexel and Knecht delayed their departure by a few hours because Knecht's ankle was sore. They stopped to take a photograph because the light was good. They rested in a hollow because they were tired. They veered off course because the trail was difficult to see. They turned back because they were disoriented. They stopped again because Knecht could not walk. Each decision, in isolation, was defensible. Each was made with the belief that there was still time to correct it. But there was not. The moment when they might have saved themselves is impossible to pinpoint. It might have been the morning of the 14th, when they chose to wait until noon. It might have been 3:30, when they rested in the hollow. It might have been 4 o'clock, when they realized they were off the trail. Or it might have been later, when they stopped for the night instead of pressing on. There is no way to know which decision, had it been made differently, would have changed the outcome. The only certainty is that by the time they understood the danger, the moment had passed. Calloway, in his deposition, was asked whether he had considered ordering Drexel and Knecht to remain at the station. He said he had not. He said it was not his place to give orders to men who were not under his supervision. He said he had offered his assessment of the weather and that they had made their own decision based on that assessment. He said he did not believe he had been negligent. The interviewer asked whether, in hindsight, he would have done anything differently. Calloway paused. He said he would have encouraged them more strongly to leave at dawn. He said he would have been more explicit about the risk of sudden storms. He said he would have insisted they wait another day. Then he said quietly that none of this would have mattered if the storm had arrived 6 hours later, or if Knecht had not stopped to rest, or if they had not veered off the trail. He said they had time. They didn't know they needed to use it. The investigation into the deaths of Paul Drexel and Samuel Knecht was concluded in February of 1897. No criminal charges were filed. No disciplinary action was taken against Morris Calloway or Thomas Beale. The Southern Pacific Railroad issued a revised set of guidelines for travelers in mountainous regions, which included recommendations for departure times, equipment, and contingency planning. The United States Weather Bureau expanded its network of stations and improved its telegraph protocols. The families of the deceased received settlements, $500 for Drexel's widow, $300 for Knecht's parents. The settlements were described as compassionate payments rather than acknowledgments of liability. The case was noted briefly in regional newspapers. The Sacramento Bee ran a short article on November 27th under the headline, "2 Men Lost in Sierra Storm." The article summarized the facts, quoted Hollis Grant, and concluded by observing that the storm had been exceptionally severe and that the men had exercised reasonable caution. There was no editorial comment. The San Francisco Chronicle did not cover the story at all. Public interest, insofar as there was any, dissipated quickly. The deaths were tragic but not unprecedented. Men died in the mountains every winter, sometimes from falls, sometimes from avalanches, sometimes from simple miscalculation. The Sierra Nevada, in particular, had a long history of claiming the lives of travelers who underestimated its severity or overestimated their own preparedness. The Donner Party, 50 years earlier, had become a symbol of such miscalculation, and the pass itself carried the weight of that history. 2 more deaths did not alter the narrative. But within the small community of people who worked in the mountains, surveyors, foresters, telegraph operators, railroad engineers, the case resonated differently. It became a cautionary example, not because it involved extraordinary negligence or recklessness, but because it did not. Drexel and Knecht had done nothing obviously wrong. They had waited for better conditions. They had consulted with experienced men. They had carried appropriate gear. They had made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. And yet they had died, not because they had been careless, but because they had not been careful enough, or soon enough. The distinction mattered. It suggested that survival in the mountains required not just competence, but a kind of preemptive urgency, a willingness to act on incomplete information, to retreat before danger became obvious. It suggested that waiting for clarity, for certainty, for the right moment, was itself a form of risk. This was a difficult lesson to internalize, because it ran counter to instinct. People wanted to believe that danger announced itself, that there would be time to respond, that reasonable precautions would suffice. The deaths at Donner Summit suggested otherwise. Eugene Marsh, the investigator, grappled with this in his report. He noted that Calloway had acted in accordance with standard practice, and that Drexel had behaved as any experienced surveyor would have. He acknowledged that the storm had been unusually abrupt, and that forecasting technology was limited. But he also argued that these factors, while mitigating, did not absolve anyone of the responsibility to err on the side of caution. He wrote, "In the mountains, there is no such thing as an acceptable delay. Time is not neutral. It accumulates risk. The men who wait for conditions to worsen before acting have already waited too long." The passage was underlined in red ink by someone at the railroad, possibly a supervisor or a senior engineer. Below it, in the same red ink, is a single word: how. It is a good question. How does one convince men to act with urgency when the danger is not yet visible? How does one override the natural human tendency to wait to gather more information, to avoid overreacting? The protocols that emerged from the Donner Summit incident, earlier departure times, stricter equipment requirements, mandatory check-ins, were attempts to answer these questions, but they were imperfect. Protocols could not account for judgment. They could not prevent hesitation. They could only create conditions under which hesitation was less likely to be fatal. Morris Calloway remained at the weather station until 1899. He was not reprimanded, but he was also not promoted. In his personal correspondence, preserved in a small archive at the University of Nevada, Reno, he refers to the incident only once, in a letter to his sister written in March of 1897. He writes, "I am asked often whether I believe I could have prevented what happened. I do not know how to answer. I believed at the time that the men were capable of reaching safety. I believed the weather, though poor, was not yet dangerous. I believed they had sufficient time. I was wrong about the time, but I do not know when I should have known I was wrong. This troubles me more than I can say." The letter is formal in tone, as was typical of Calloway's correspondence, but the repetition of "I believed" suggests something less composed. It suggests a man trying to reconcile his actions with their consequences, trying to locate the moment when belief became error. He never found it. In 1899, he left the weather station and took a position as a clerk in Carson City. He did not work in the mountains again. Thomas Beale, the assistant, left sooner. He resigned in January of 1897, citing personal reasons. In his exit interview conducted by a representative of the Weather Bureau, he said he no longer trusted his own judgment. He said he had been certain the weather was safe, and he had been wrong, and he did not know how to distinguish between certainty and ignorance. The representative noted this in the interview record, but offered no response. Beale moved to Sacramento and found work as a telegraph operator for a mining company. He did not return to the Sierra. Paul Drexel's widow, Helen, received letters of condolence from the Southern Pacific Railroad, from the Weather Bureau, and from several of her husband's colleagues. One of these letters, written by a surveyor named George Farris, described Drexel as a man who never took unnecessary risks, and a man who believed in preparation. Farris wrote, "Paul was not reckless. He was, if anything, too cautious. I believe this is what makes his death so difficult to accept. He did everything right, and it was not enough." Helen Drexel saved this letter. It is preserved among her papers at the California Historical Society. Beside it, in a folder labeled November 1896, is a photograph of her husband standing beside a surveyor's theodolite taken sometime in 1895. He is smiling. The mountains are visible in the background. The sky is clear. Samuel Knecht's parents, who lived in Ohio, never visited the Sierra Nevada. They requested that their son's body be returned to them, and it was by train, in December. They buried him in a cemetery outside Columbus. The headstone reads, Samuel Knecht, 1867-1896. He died far from home. There is no mention of how he died, or why. Hollis Grant, who led the search party, continued to work in Cisco Grove until 1902. He participated in several other searches over the years, most of them successful. In an interview conducted in 1910 by a journalist writing about mountain rescue efforts, Grant was asked what he had learned from the Donner Summit case. He said, "I learned that people wait too long. They wait because they believe they have time. They wait because they don't want to overreact. They wait because someone else, someone they trust, tells them it's safe to wait, and then they die, not because they were foolish, but because they were reasonable. The journalist asked whether Grant believed the deaths could have been prevented. Grant said yes. He said if Drexel and Knecht had left at dawn, they would have reached Cisco Grove before the storm. He said if they had stayed at the station, they would have been safe. He said if they had turned back when they realized they were off the trail, they might have made it. He said there were a dozen moments when a different decision would have saved them. Then he said, "But I don't blame them. I don't blame Calloway. I don't even blame the weather. I blame the idea that there's always more time. There isn't, and no one knows that until it's too late." The deaths of Paul Drexel and Samuel Knecht have not become famous. They do not appear in histories of the Sierra Nevada. They are not commemorated by plaques or memorials. The trail where they died has been rebuilt and rerouted several times, and there is no marker to indicate the site of their final shelter. Most people who hike the Donner Summit region today do not know the story. Those who do tend to regard it as unfortunate but unremarkable, one of many tragedies that occurred during a less forgiving era when weather forecasting was primitive and mountain travel was dangerous by default. This is not an unfair assessment. By contemporary standards, the precautions taken by Drexel and Knecht seem inadequate. They carried no emergency shelter, no signaling devices, no means of starting a fire in wet conditions. They relied on visual navigation in an environment where visibility could vanish in minutes. They did not inform anyone of their precise route or their expected arrival time. These omissions, which seem glaring now, were not unusual at the time. Men traveled in the mountains with the equipment they had, which was often insufficient, and they made decisions based on the information available, which was often incomplete. That most of them survived was a matter of luck, as much as skill. But the case is worth revisiting, not because it was exceptional, but because it was not. It represents a particular kind of failure, one that recurs across contexts and eras. The failure to recognize urgency in the absence of panic. Drexel and Knecht did not die because they ignored warnings. They died because the warnings were subtle, incremental, and easy to rationalize away. The sky was overcast but not black. The snow was falling, but not yet heavily. The trail was difficult to see, but not yet invisible. At every stage, the situation was concerning but not yet critical, and so they continued, believing, reasonably, that they could manage. This is how most delays occur. They do not announce themselves as delays. They present as prudent pauses, as sensible recalibrations, as minor adjustments that will not alter the overall plan. It is only later, when the window has closed, that the delay reveals itself to have been consequential, and by then, the opportunity to act has passed. Morris Calloway understood this, though he struggled to articulate it. In his letter to his sister, he described his uncertainty about when he should have known the weather was dangerous. But the problem was not that he lacked knowledge. The problem was that knowledge in the mountains is always incomplete. One can never be certain that conditions will worsen, only that they might. One can never know exactly when action becomes necessary, only that it becomes necessary before it feels necessary. This is the paradox. The moment to act is the moment when action still seems premature. Drexel and Knecht faced the same paradox. They delayed their departure because it seemed safer to wait. They rested because it seemed reasonable to rest. They stopped for the night because continuing seemed more dangerous than stopping. None of these decisions was irrational, but each one consumed time they did not have. And together, they ensured that when the danger became undeniable, they were no longer in a position to escape it. The historical record offers no insight into whether they understood this at the end. Drexel's final journal entry suggests that he still believed rescue was possible, that the storm would clear, that they could reach the station. But the position in which the bodies were found, seated together, motionless, heads bowed, suggests resignation rather than hope. It suggests that at some point, perhaps during the night of November 15th, they realized they were not going to make it. And having realized this, they stopped trying. There is a temptation when studying such cases to search for the decisive error, the single choice that determined the outcome. But this search is almost always futile. Deaths like these are not the result of one mistake. They are the result of a series of small, defensible choices that, in aggregate, lead to an indefensible outcome. Each choice seems minor at the time. Each feels reversible. It is only in hindsight that the pattern becomes clear, and by then it is too late to alter it. This is why the case continues to be studied, albeit quietly, by people who work in fields where timing matters. Search and rescue operations, disaster response, emergency medicine. The question it poses, how do you convince people to act before they believe action is necessary, has no simple answer. Training helps, protocols help, experience helps. But none of these eliminate the fundamental problem, which is that human beings are inclined to wait for clarity, and clarity, in emergencies, arrives too late. The Donner Summit incident of 1896 is preserved in a handful of archival collections. The California State Library, the Southern Pacific Railroad Archives, the Weather Bureau records in Washington, D.C. The documents are fragile and rarely accessed. Most of them have not been digitized. The journal, the depositions, the correspondence, the maps, all of it sits in acid-free folders in climate-controlled rooms, waiting for someone to care enough to read it. This account has been assembled from those documents. It has attempted to reconstruct as accurately as possible what happened during the 4 days between November 14th and November 18th, 1896. It has relied on testimony, on physical evidence, on meteorological data, and on the recorded observations of the men who searched for Drexel and Knecht and found them too late. It has not speculated about their thoughts or feelings. It has not dramatized their deaths. It has simply presented what is known, which is this. 2 men left a weather station at noon on a clear day. They walked into a storm. They did not turn back. They died 4 miles from where they started, within a few hours' walk of safety, because they believed they had time. They were wrong. History knows why. They hesitated. They waited. They hoped. And while they waited, the window closed. It always does.